Whispers tore through Bitter Creek when Abigail Sterling surrendered her silk gowns for dirt and pine needles. Marrying a ragged mountain trapper seemed like financial suicide, a desperate gamble to escape a vicious debt collector. Society ladies scoffed, predicting she would freeze before winter snow arrived. Nobody knew this beggar in bearskin held maps to a forgotten empire, far above jagged Colorado timberlines. Hidden within an eternal storm lay secrets that would rewrite history. It began as a scandalous marriage of convenience. It ended in clouds. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden block with the finality of a coffin nail. With that single, sharp crack, the last remnant of the Sterling family's legacy, a mahogany grand piano imported from Vienna was sold to the highest bidder. Abigail Sterling stood in the dusty square of Bitter Creek, Colorado, her posture rigid, her chin held high despite the humiliating spectacle. The year was 1883, and the unforgiving frontier had finally devoured her father's crumbling silver empire. Arthur Sterling, once the most formidable mining tycoon in the territory, sat slumped on a wooden crate nearby, a broken man staring vacantly at the muddy boots of the townsfolk who had gathered to pick over the bones of his ruined life. Across the square, leaning against the hitching post of the assay office, stood Reginald Montgomery. He was a man of immense wealth and grotesque character, a ruthless financier who had deliberately engineered Arthur's downfall by calling in debts during a silver panic. Montgomery tipped his bowler hat toward Abigail, his lips curling into a predatory smile. He had made his ultimatum painfully clear the night before. Abigail would become his bride, signing over herself and the last hidden deeds to the Sterling claims, or her father would face federal prison for a fabricated charge of embezzlement. Montgomery had given her until sundown to surrender. Abigail turned away from his leer, her mind racing. Bitter Creek was a lawless, isolated town where money dictated morality. There was no judge to appeal to, no sympathetic sheriff to intervene. Her only escape was a loophole in the draconian territorial marriage laws she had read about in her father's legal library, a woman's debts, and any legal leverage held against her family through her, transferred entirely to her husband upon marriage. If she married a man utterly outside Montgomery's sphere of influence, someone untouchable, unreachable, and with absolutely nothing to lose, she could sever Montgomery's legal grip on her father. Her desperate gaze swept the bustling, muddy street. Cowboys, miners, and merchants moved about, all of them either on Montgomery's payroll or too terrified to cross him. Then she saw him. Emerging from the shadows of the general store was a figure the town locals whispered about but actively avoided. His name was Silas Caldwell. To the civilized folk of Bitter Creek, he was a savage, a ghostly mountain man who descended from the treacherous San Juan peaks twice a year to trade high-quality pelts for salt, black powder, and coffee. He stood well over 6 feet, draped in layers of heavy, weather-beaten wolf and bear fur. His dark hair was long and unkempt, his face obscured by a thick beard and the shadow of a wide-brimmed, battered leather hat. He smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and raw earth. He was the poorest, most primitive man in the territory, and he was leaving town. Abigail gathered the skirts of her faded gray traveling dress and marched through the ankle-deep mud, ignoring the shocked gasps of the society wives who watched her. She intercepted the mountain man just as he was tightening the cinch on his massive, heavily muscled pack horse. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice trembling but surprisingly loud. The man paused. He did not turn immediately. When he finally looked down at her, Abigail was startled to find eyes of a piercing, crystalline blue, sharp, intelligent, and entirely devoid of the madness the townsfolk claimed he possessed. "Miss Sterling," he replied. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth and completely lacking the coarse drawl of the local miners. "I have a proposition for you," Abigail said, glancing over her shoulder to see Montgomery's men beginning to notice the interaction. "I need a husband. Today, within the hour, and I need to leave this town immediately." Silas Caldwell stared at her, his expression unreadable behind the beard. He slowly let go of the saddle strap. The mountains are no place for a woman of your station. Winter is breathing down the neck of the high passes. You would be dead in a week. I will be dead if I stay here, Abigail countered, pulling a heavy silver pocket watch from her bodice, the only heirloom she had managed to hide from the debt collectors. This is solid sterling silver. It is yours. Marry me. Take me away from Bitter Creek, and when we reach the nearest civilized outpost on the other side of the range, we can annul the union. You get the silver, and I get my freedom. Silas looked at the watch, then up at the balcony where Reginald Montgomery was now standing, his face purple with sudden, furious comprehension. The financier was shouting orders to his hired guns. Silas looked back down at the desperate, beautiful woman standing in the mud before him. A strange, fleeting emotion crossed his eyes, a look of profound recognition, or perhaps calculated duty. Keep your watch, Abigail, Silas said softly. If we do this, there is no turning back. Where I go, the law of men like Montgomery does not exist. Then take me there, she pleaded. 10 minutes later, inside the dusty, chaotic office of Magistrate William Henderson, history was made. With Montgomery's thugs pounding on the locked heavy oak door, Henderson, terrified by the intimidating presence of the towering mountain man, hastily signed and stamped the marriage certificate. By the authority vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you man and wife, Henderson stammered, wiping sweat from his brow. Silas didn't kiss her. He simply grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle but immovable, and kicked open the back exit of the office. They mounted his waiting horses in the alleyway, just as the front door splintered inward. With a crack of the reins, the poorest man in Bitter Creek and its most fallen aristocrat rode out into the biting wind, leaving the fury of Reginald Montgomery echoing in the canyon behind them. By nightfall, Bitter Creek was nothing more than a faint constellation of orange specks in the dark abyss below. The ascent into the San Juan Mountains was brutal, a sheer vertical climb through switchbacks that defied gravity. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation, the autumn air turning into a razor-sharp chill that sliced right through Abigail's woolen coat. She clung to the saddle horn of her roan mare, her body aching in ways she hadn't known were possible. She had expected silence from her new husband, the grunting stoicism of an uneducated trapper, but Silas was different. He moved through the treacherous, pitch-black terrain with a fluid, preternatural grace, his eyes seemingly able to pierce the gloom. He didn't just survive in this wilderness, he commanded it. When they finally made camp beneath the massive overhang of a granite cliff, Abigail practically fell from her horse. Her legs gave way, but before she could hit the frozen earth, Silas caught her. "Sit," he instructed quietly, guiding her to a flat stone. Within minutes, he had a smokeless fire blazing, a feat of bushcraft she couldn't comprehend. He brought her a tin cup of hot, steeped pine needle tea and a piece of dried venison. As she drank the bitter, warming liquid, she watched him. He had removed his heavy bearskin coat, revealing a surprisingly well-tailored, albeit worn, woolen tunic beneath. As he leaned over the fire to stoke the embers, the neckline of the tunic shifted, and Abigail caught a glimpse of something glinting against his chest. It was a heavy gold medallion, intricately etched with a geometric crest, a silver tree with roots wrapped around a sword. It was not the trinket of a savage. Later, as Abigail huddled beneath a thick woven blanket Silas had provided, she peeked out to see him sitting by the fire. He was not whittling wood or cleaning a rifle. He was reading. It was a small, leather-bound book, and from the brief glimpse she caught of the pages, the text was not English. The characters looked like Latin or ancient Greek. "Who are you, really?" she whispered into the wind. Too exhausted to ask him aloud, the answer to that question began to unravel on the afternoon of their third day. They had crossed the snow line, entering a desolate, white wilderness at 10,000 feet. The silence of the peaks was absolute, broken only by the crunch of hooves
This story
in the
was
snow.
posted on the channel The
Suddenly,
Rusty Saddle.
Silas pulled
Please
his
do
horse
not
to a halt.
repost it in any
His
form.
posture stiffened. He didn't look back, but his voice was a low command. "Dismount, Abigail. Get behind the rocks to your left. Keep your head down." "What is it?" she asked, her heart hammering. "Montgomery's dogs are better trackers than I anticipated." Before she could fully process the danger, a rifle shot rang out, echoing like a cannon blast against the canyon walls. Snow kicked up inches from Silas's horse. Abigail threw herself from the saddle, scrambling behind a large boulder just as three men emerged from the timberline below them. Leading them was Josiah Trent, Montgomery's chief enforcer, a man notorious for his cruelty and precision. "End of the line, Caldwell." Trent's voice boomed up the pass. "Leave the girl and the horses, and I might let you run back to your cave." Silas did not run. He did not draw the old, rusted hunting rifle strapped to his saddle. Instead, he reached under his heavy furs and drew a pair of long, beautifully balanced hunting knives that gleamed with a deadly Damascus steel pattern. "Stay out of sight," Silas murmured to Abigail. What followed was not a crude frontier shootout. It was a slaughter orchestrated with terrifying mathematical precision. As Trent's men advanced, firing their revolvers, Silas moved. He did not dodge haphazardly. He seemed to anticipate their lines of fire, using the jagged terrain for cover as he closed the distance with impossible speed. He descended upon the first man like a shadow, deflecting a gun barrel with the flat of his blade before executing a flawless, disarming sweep that sent the man crashing into the snow, unconscious before he stopped rolling. The second thug managed to fire a shot that grazed Silas's shoulder, but the mountain man didn't even flinch. He spun, driving the hilt of his knife into the man's sternum with a sickening crunch, dropping him instantly. Trent, realizing he was severely outmatched, panicked. He aimed his Winchester rifle at Abigail's hiding spot. "Hold it, Caldwell, or she dies." Silas froze, his eyes locking onto Trent. The mountain man's demeanor shifted from cold efficiency to an overwhelming, lethal authority. "Lower the weapon, Josiah," Silas commanded. His voice echoed with a strange acoustic resonance, commanding and absolute. It was the voice of a general addressing a mutinous foot soldier. Trent hesitated, his hands shaking. "Who the hell are you?" In that split second of hesitation, Silas threw one of his blades. It didn't strike Trent. It struck the frozen branch of a dead pine tree directly above him. A massive sheet of accumulated snow and ice collapsed, burying Trent in an avalanche of freezing white. Silas walked over, retrieved his knife from the snow, and looked down at the struggling enforcer. "Tell Montgomery," Silas said quietly, "that Abigail Sterling is under the protection of the High Reach. If he sends men up this mountain again, I will not leave them breathing." Abigail slowly stood up from behind her rock, trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. She looked at the man she had married. The grime and the ragged furs were an illusion. Beneath them stood a warrior of unparalleled skill, a man guarding secrets far heavier than the snow on the peaks. "Let's move," Silas said, wiping the snow from his shoulder. "The gate is not much further." They climbed for another 2 days, pushing past 12,000 feet. The air thinned dramatically, burning Abigail's lungs with every shallow breath. The world turned into a monochrome nightmare of gray stone, white snow, and a violently blue sky. Abigail felt her mind slipping into the edges of altitude sickness. Her vision blurred, and the world seemed to spin lazily around her. When she grew too weak to sit in the saddle, Silas walked beside her, wrapping his strong arm around her waist, physically anchoring her to the earth. "Just a little further, Abigail," he whispered, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in her delirium. "Breathe with me. In, out. You are stronger than you know." "There is nothing up here," she rasped, her lips cracked and bleeding. "We are climbing to the roof of the world just to die." "We are climbing to the roof of the world to live," he corrected gently. On the afternoon of the 6th day, The path abruptly ended. They stood on a narrow ledge overlooking a terrifying drop into a misty abyss. Before them rose a sheer face of solid, seamless black granite that stretched hundreds of feet into the sky. A dense, unnatural fog rolled off the cliff, concealing the drop below. It was a dead end. Abigail slid from her horse, tears of sheer exhaustion freezing on her cheeks. It's over. There is nowhere else to go. Silas tied the horses to a stunted, frozen shrub. He walked to the face of the black granite cliff. He removed his thick leather glove, exposing his calloused hand to the biting wind. He began to trace his fingers over the seemingly blank stone, muttering something under his breath. It sounded like the Latin she had seen in his book. Suddenly, he pressed his palm flat against a specific section of the rock wall. He pushed, throwing his considerable weight into it. Deep within the mountain, a sound reverberated. It was not the natural groan of settling stone, but the heavy, metallic grind of colossal gears and counterweights. The earth beneath Abigail's boots trembled. To her absolute disbelief, a massive section of the cliff face, a block of granite weighing dozens of tons, began to slowly pivot inward on a central, hidden axis. Warm air, smelling inexplicably of blooming jasmine and wet earth, rushed out from the dark opening, melting the snow at Abigail's feet. "Come," Silas said, extending his hand to her. Too stunned to speak, Abigail took his hand. He led her and the horses into the dark tunnel. As they crossed the threshold, the massive stone door ground shut behind them with a booming thud, plunging them into darkness. But only for a moment. A soft, golden hum began to emanate from the walls. Abigail gasped as intricate, glass-enclosed brass lamps, fueled by some unknown, odorless gas, flickered to life along the tunnel's length. The tunnel was perfectly smooth, cut with architectural precision that rivaled the finest engineering of New York or London. They walked for perhaps a mile, the incline gradually sloping downward. The air grew steadily warmer, the biting frost of the Colorado winter replaced by a balmy, soothing heat. Finally, the tunnel curved, and bright, natural sunlight poured in from the exit. Silas stepped aside, allowing Abigail to walk out into the light first. When she emerged, her breath left her entirely. They stood on a balcony carved into the side of a massive, bowl-shaped caldera. Below them lay a sprawling, lush valley, entirely hidden from the outside world by a perpetual ring of storm clouds and jagged peaks. The valley was alive with vibrant green vegetation, fed by steaming geothermal rivers that crisscrossed the landscape. But it was not just a natural wonder. The valley was inhabited. Towering structures of gleaming white stone and dark wood rose from the valley floor, a breathtaking architectural fusion of ancient Roman grandeur and sweeping functional modernity. Aqueducts carried steaming water to terraced gardens, and immense wind catchers spun silently on the ridges. It was a city of impossible beauty, thriving in the clouds. As they descended a wide, sweeping stone staircase toward the valley floor, a group of people approached them. They were dressed in elegant, practical garments made of fine woven wool and silk. They carried themselves with an aristocratic grace, yet their hands bore the calluses of scholars and laborers alike. Leading them was an older man with a silver beard, wearing a tailored coat that matched the crest on Silas's hidden medallion. The older man stopped, his eyes widening as he looked from Silas to the bewildered Abigail. The group immediately knelt, bowing their heads in profound respect. "Commander Caldwell," the older man said, his voice ringing out across the quiet terrace. "The Sentinel has returned. We feared you lost to the winter." Silas placed a reassuring hand on Abigail's trembling shoulder. He looked at the elder, his posture shifting entirely. The stooped, ragged mountain man vanished, replaced by a man of royal bearing and undeniable authority. "I am home, Marcus," Silas said, before pausing to look down at his bride. "And I have brought my wife, the new Lady of Athelgard." Abigail's knees finally buckled, not from the cold or the altitude, but from the sheer, staggering weight of the truth. She hadn't married the town's poorest outcast. She had married a king. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung
This story
shut,
was posted on the channel
silencing
The Rusty
bustling
Saddle.
sounds
Please
of the
do not
valley
repost
below.
it in any form.
Abigail stood in the center of a circular room, bathed in the warm, golden light of dozens of intricate brass lamps. The floor was a mosaic of polished obsidian and quartz, depicting a map of the very mountains she had just nearly died climbing. She was still shivering, though not from the cold. The geothermal warmth radiating from the stone floors was incredibly soothing, but her mind was entirely overwhelmed by the staggering impossibility of her situation. "I apologize for the deception, Abigail," Silas said softly. He had discarded the heavy, foul-smelling furs of the mountain trapper. Beneath them, he wore a finely woven charcoal tunic, heavy canvas trousers, and knee-high leather boots. Without the grime and the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, he was undeniably handsome. His features were aristocratic, sharp, and commanding, yet tempered by a profound, enduring weariness. "Deception is a remarkably mild word for this, Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, her voice trembling as she walked toward a massive archway overlooking the valley. Below, terraced gardens overflowed with winter wheat, root vegetables, and medicinal herbs, all kept alive by a brilliant system of steam-heated glasshouses. "You let the entire territory believe you were a feral scavenger. You let them spit at your feet. Pride is a luxury that dead men cannot afford," Silas replied, stepping up beside her. "And secrecy is the only wall that keeps Ethelgard standing. If the robber barons of the East men like Jay Gould or your shadow, Reginald Montgomery, knew what rested in this caldera, they would bring an army of 10,000 men to tear it apart." "What is this place?" she asked, her eyes tracing the lines of a massive aqueduct that carried steaming water from a natural geyser down into the city below. "Who built it?" "It was begun nearly a century ago," Silas explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a historian. "A splinter group of engineers, philosophers, and naturalists who saw the coming industrial slaughter of the continent. They retreated into the most inhospitable terrain they could find. They discovered this geothermal caldera, perfectly shielded by the altitude and the perpetual storm systems of the high peaks. Over decades, they built a sanctuary, a place where the pursuit of knowledge outranked the pursuit of profit." He turned to her, his blue eyes intense. "I was not born here, Abigail. I was born in Boston. I was an engineer, contracted by the federal government to survey these mountains for the transcontinental railroad routes. I found a trail I wasn't supposed to find. The people of Ethelgard captured me. They gave me a choice: remain here forever and lend my mind to their survival, or be cast back down the mountain with no memory of the path. I chose to stay. Over time, I became their sentinel. My job is to walk the outer world, gather necessary supplies, and ensure the veil of superstition keeps the curious away." Abigail touched her forehead, a dull ache throbbing behind her eyes. "Then why bring me here? If secrecy is your only defense, why marry the most high-profile, scandal-ridden woman in Bitter Creek and drag her to your fortress?" Silas reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dirt-streaked hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, sending a sudden, unexpected warmth cascading down her spine. "Because your father, Arthur Sterling, was not just a disgraced silver miner. Before his mind broke from the pressure, he was the only outsider who had ever deduced the existence of Ethelgard." Abigail gasped, taking a step back. "My father? But he never spoke of this. He spent his life digging in the dirt for silver veins." "The silver was a front," Silas corrected. "Arthur was looking for us. He had pieced together local indigenous legends, anomalous topographical maps from the 1850s, and peculiar geological surveys. He didn't know what was up here, but he knew there was an anomaly. He bought up thousands of acres of worthless high-altitude claims to secure the land surrounding our lower passes. That is what Montgomery truly wants. Montgomery doesn't care about the played-out silver mines of Bitter Creek. He wants your father's final deeds. He wants the legal rights to the San Juan Peaks. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Montgomery's relentless persecution of her father, the fabricated debts, the desperate ultimatum of marriage. It was all a calculated maneuver to legally possess the land deeds Arthur Sterling had hoarded. By marrying Silas, the poorest man in town, Abigail had legally transferred those deeds to a phantom. She had unwittingly checkmated Reginald Montgomery. "You used me," she stated, the betrayal stinging her exhausted heart. "I saved you," Silas countered firmly, though his eyes softened with regret. "Montgomery would have killed your father the moment you signed those papers, and he would have sold you to the highest bidder once he was done with you. I stepped out of the shadows to protect the valley. Yes, but when I saw you standing in the mud, staring down a monster with nothing but a silver pocket watch and your own fierce courage, I realized I could not leave you to the wolves." Before Abigail could respond, the heavy doors to the hall groaned open. A tall, gaunt man with a neatly trimmed silver beard hurried into the room. He wore a dark wool coat and carried a brass-bound spyglass. His face was pale, drawn tight with sudden panic. "Commander," the man said, breathing heavily, "forgive the intrusion." "What is it, Thaddeus?" Silas asked, his demeanor instantly snapping back to that of a military leader. "The perimeter alarms on the lower switchbacks have been tripped," Thaddeus reported grimly. "The acoustic mirrors have picked up the sound of heavy mules. And dynamite?" Silas cursed under his breath. A sharp, bitter sound. "Montgomery." "Worse," Thaddeus said, handing Silas the spyglass. "Our forward scouts identified the men leading the expedition. Montgomery didn't just send his local thugs. He hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and they are being guided by Charlie Siringo." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Even in the sheltered parlors of her former life, the name Charlie Siringo was infamous. He was a legendary Pinkerton agent, a man known for tracking outlaws across thousand-mile stretches of unforgiving desert and mountain. If Siringo was on their trail, the superstition and ghost stories of the mountain man would not stop him. "They are attempting to blast the false avalanche chutes we built to disguise the main pass," Thaddeus continued. "Siringo is smart. He noticed the blast patterns from your encounter with Josiah Trent. He knows someone is up here." "How long do we have?" Silas asked, already striding toward a heavy wooden armoire at the far end of the hall. "3 days? Perhaps 4. If the incoming blizzard hits them hard enough," Thaddeus replied. Silas threw open the doors of the armoire, revealing not just rifles, but heavy, repeating firearms and crates of explosives. "Then we prepare for war. Barricade the inner gates. Pressurize the steam vents on the narrow pass. If Siringo wants to climb to the roof of the world, we will make sure he burns when he gets here." For 3 agonizing days, the Valley of Aethelgard transformed from a serene, utopian sanctuary into a fortified citadel. The gentle hum of the geothermal pumps was replaced by the deafening, metallic clatter of the forges, working day and night to produce ammunition and reinforce the massive steel and granite doors that guarded the main tunnel. Abigail did not sit idle. Discarding the remnants of her Bitter Creek life entirely, she had been given the practical attire of the valley women: fitted wool trousers, a heavy linen shirt, and a sturdy leather corset that provided warmth and back support. She tied her dark hair back with a piece of twine and threw herself into the preparations, organizing the medical supplies in the infirmary alongside the valley's physicians. She found a strange, unexpected peace in the relentless work. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a pawn in a rich man's game. She was an active participant in her own survival. On the evening of the 3rd day, the storm broke. The perpetual clouds swirling around the peaks parted slightly, revealing a bruised violet twilight. The silence that followed the cessation of the wind was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Silas found her in the armory, meticulously counting bandages and vials of morphine. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. He was fully armed, a heavy Winchester repeater slung across his back, and twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips. The silver medallion of Aethelgard gleamed against the dark wool of his coat. "You look like a queen preparing for a siege," Silas said quietly.
This story was
stepping
posted
into
on the
room.
channel The Rusty
Abigail
Saddle.
wiped the
Please
sweat
do
from
not
her brow,
repost it in any
offering
form.
a tired, fleeting smile. "I feel like a very exhausted ledger keeper. Are they close?" "Seringo's men breached the false timberline an hour ago," Silas admitted, his voice devoid of fear but heavy with consequence. "They lost a dozen men to the frost and our trap wires, but Montgomery's pockets are deep. They are pushing forward. They will reach the Black Wall by midnight." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She closed the lid of the medical crate and walked toward him. The anger and betrayal she had felt upon learning the truth of their marriage had dissolved over the past 3 days, replaced by a profound, terrifying admiration for the man standing before her. He had carried the weight of hundreds of lives on his shoulders for years, living as an outcast, enduring the scorn of the world to protect a miracle. "I brought this to your door," she whispered, looking down at his boots. "If I hadn't forced you to marry me, Montgomery would never have had the legal incentive to push this far. I traded your kingdom for my own life." Silas closed the distance between them, bringing his hands up to cup her face. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones, forcing her to look up into his piercing blue eyes. "Listen to me, Abigail Sterling," he commanded softly, the authority in his voice laced with a raw, undeniable tenderness. "Montgomery was coming regardless. He has been buying up the territory for 2 years. He would have eventually hired Seringo, and they would have found the pass. You did not bring ruin to this valley. You brought us the warning we desperately needed." He stepped closer, the heat of his body radiating through his heavy coat. "When I saw you in that square, defying a man who held the power of life and death over your family, I didn't see a liability. I saw a spirit that belonged to the mountains. I saw a woman who refused to break." Abigail's breath hitched. The air between them, already thick with the tension of the impending battle, suddenly crackled with a different kind of electricity. "We signed a paper in a dusty office to cheat a tyrant," Silas murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "But in the eyes of this mountain, and in my own heart, the vow was real. I swore to protect you, Abigail, and I will." He kissed her. It was not the chaste, formal kiss of an arranged society marriage. It was desperate, fierce, and consuming a claim staked at the edge of the world, fueled by the adrenaline of the coming storm. Abigail leaned into him, her hands gripping the heavy wool of his lapels, pulling him closer. She tasted wood smoke, cold mountain air, and absolute certainty. For a fleeting, perfect moment, the looming threat of the Pinkertons vanished, leaving only the heat of the fire and the man who had stolen her away to the clouds. When he finally pulled away, both of them were breathless. Silas rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have to go to the lower tunnels," he whispered. "Seringo is smart. He won't just assault the front gate. He will look for the ventilation shafts. I need to collapse them before his men find the grates." He reached into his coat and unclasped the heavy gold and silver medallion from around his neck. He placed the chain over Abigail's head, the cold metal settling heavy against her collarbone. "This is the commander's seal," Silas said, stepping back, his expression turning grave. "Thaddeus and the inner guard will answer to whoever wears it. If I do not return by dawn, you are to order the final collapse. You will blow the main pillars of the access tunnel. It will seal Aethelgard forever. You will be safe, but no one will ever be able to leave." Panic seized her throat. "Silas, no. I won't leave you out there. You are the lady of Aethelgard now," he said firmly, backing toward the door. "You protect our people. That is the burden of the crown." Before she could argue further, a sound echoed through the valley, a sound so violent and massive that the stone walls of the armory vibrated. It was a deep, concussive boom that rolled like thunder, followed by the terrifying, tearing sound of a mountain giving way. "Dynamite?" Silas hissed, turning toward the door. "They are at the Black Wall." "Silas!" Abigail called out, running to the doorway. He paused in the corridor, looking back at her one last time. "Hold the line, Abigail." He vanished into the shadows, running toward the front lines. Abigail stood alone in the doorway, her fingers gripping the heavy medallion at her chest. The valley outside was suddenly plunged into chaos. The great warning bells atop the central watchtower began to toll, a mournful, frantic ringing that echoed off the high peaks. The siege of the Sky Kingdom had begun, and the poorest mountain man in Bitter Creek was riding into the fire to save it. The explosion at the Black Wall tore through the valley like the roar of a wounded leviathan. Dust and fractured granite rained down from the cavernous ceiling above the main tunnel entrance, sending shockwaves that rippled through the glass houses of Ethelgard. Abigail stood rooted to the armory floor, the heavy silver and gold medallion burning against her collarbone. Silas was out there, walking into a storm of lead and dynamite to buy them time. She did not wait for the dust to settle. Grabbing a heavy wool cloak, Abigail sprinted toward the central watchtower. The stone steps were slick with the condensation of the geothermal vents, but she climbed with a desperate, frantic energy. When she burst into the command observatory at the top, she found Thaddeus and a young, soot-stained engineer named Harrison hunched over a brass acoustic mirror, listening to the horrifying symphony of the breach. "Report," Abigail commanded, her voice cutting through the panic in the room. It was not the voice of a disgraced socialite. It was the sharp, unyielding tone of Arthur Sterling's daughter, a woman who had spent her childhood listening to mining foremen shout over the roar of stamp mills. Thaddeus looked up, his face pale in the gaslight. "My lady, the Pinkertons have blown the outer facade. Siringo's men are in the primary access tunnel. They are using repeating rifles and portable Gatling guns to suppress our inner guard. Commander Caldwell has ordered a fallback to the secondary choke point." But what, Thaddeus?" she demanded, stepping up to the brass instrument. "Montgomery is with them," Harrison interjected, his hands trembling as he adjusted a pressure valve. "And he didn't just bring mercenaries. He brought mining engineers. They aren't trying to fight their way through the labyrinth. They are drilling into the load-bearing rock of the tunnel ceiling. They intend to collapse the defensive gates entirely and march over the rubble." Abigail's blood ran cold. Reginald Montgomery was a monster, but he was a highly educated one. He knew that taking a fortified bottleneck was suicide, so he was altering the battlefield. Deep within the primary tunnel, the air was thick with cordite and pulverized stone. Silas Caldwell pressed his back against a massive granite pillar, reloading his Colt revolvers by touch in the suffocating darkness. Beside him, 3 of Ethelgard's best sentinels lay wounded, the victim of a brutal crossfire, orchestrated by Charlie Siringo. "Caldwell," a voice echoed down the smoke-filled corridor. It was not the gruff, pragmatic shout of the Pinkerton detective. It was the polished, arrogant drawl of Reginald Montgomery. "I know you can hear me, you feral savage. Did you really think stealing my bride would keep me from my prize?" Silas signaled for his remaining men to fall back behind the next set of iron blast doors. "The only prize you'll find here, Montgomery, is a shallow grave in the permafrost." Silas roared back, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the tunnel. A cruel laugh echoed through the dark. "You underestimate me, Silas. Or should I say, Commander. I didn't just seize Arthur Sterling's ledgers. I found his private journals. I know about the geothermal engines. I know about the unrefined gold veins your people use to plate your machinery. But most importantly, I know about the medallion of the High Reach." Silas froze. "The medallion? It's a key, isn't it?" Montgomery taunted, his voice growing closer as his men laid down a suppressive blanket of fire. "Arthur wrote that the city's main atmospheric vents and emergency vaults can only be accessed by the commander's seal. So, be a good primitive and bring it to me, or Siringo's sappers will blow the roof of this tunnel and crush you all." Silas felt his chest tighten. He had given the medallion to Abigail. If Montgomery broke through, he would stop at nothing to tear it from her neck. The sheer thought of Montgomery
This
laying
story
a
was
hand on
posted
her
on the
ignited
channel
a
The Rusty
terrifying
Saddle.
primal
Please do
rage
not
within
repost it in
Silas.
any form.
He wasn't just fighting for a hidden utopia anymore. He was fighting for his wife. "Harrison," Silas yelled into the speaking tube embedded in the tunnel wall. "Pressurize the defensive vents. Flush the tunnel with the geyser steam. Siringo's men won't be able to breathe, let alone drill." Up in the watchtower, Harrison scrambled to the valve controls, but a horrific screech of metal stopped him. A pressure gauge shattered, spewing hot water across the stone floor. "My lady, we can't!" Harrison cried out, shielding his face. Montgomery's blast fractured the main steam pipe running parallel to the tunnel. "If I open the defensive vents, the back pressure will rupture the caldera's main geyser seal. It won't just flush the tunnel. It will trigger a catastrophic steam explosion. It will blow the entire front half of the mountain off with Commander Caldwell inside it." Abigail stared at the shattered gauge. Montgomery had unknowingly trapped them in a fatal paradox. If they did nothing, the Pinkertons would breach the city. If they unleashed the steam to stop them, Silas would be boiled alive in the ensuing eruption. "There is another way," Thaddeus said quietly, his eyes locked on the floor. "The commander's final order. The medallion." Abigail clutched the heavy gold and silver crest at her chest. "The main pillars." "Yes," Thaddeus whispered. "If you insert the medallion into the master console here in the tower, it will trigger the failsafe. It detonates charges embedded deep in the mountain's roots. It will instantly collapse the entire mile-long access tunnel, crushing Montgomery, Siringo, and their men." "And Silas?" Abigail finished, her voice breaking. "Silas is in that tunnel. He knew the risks, Lady Abigail," Thaddeus pleaded, tears gleaming in his eyes. "He gave you the seal, so you could save the many at the cost of the one. You must do it. Montgomery's drills are through the first layer. We have minutes." Abigail looked out over the sprawling, beautiful valley of Ethelgard. She saw the children being ushered into the deep infirmary, the scholars standing ready with makeshift weapons. Silas had spent his entire life protecting this miracle. He had pulled her from the mud of Bitter Creek and shown her the stars. He had asked her to be a queen. Queens do not surrender, and queens do not sacrifice their kings. "No," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Thaddeus stared at her in horror. "My lady, if they breach—" "I said no, Thaddeus," Abigail snapped, spinning to face Harrison. "You said opening the vents would cause a back pressure rupture in the main geyser seal, causing a massive explosion." "Yes, my lady. It would tear the tunnel apart from the inside out." "But what if we direct the explosion?" Abigail asked, her mind racing, tapping into the mechanical intuition she had absorbed from her father. "What if we don't let it rupture randomly? What if we manually open the geyser's atmospheric exhaust shafts on the surface of the mountain, right above the tunnel?" Harrison's eyes went wide. "The exhaust shafts bypass the tunnel entirely. If we vent the geyser through the surface, the pressure in the tunnel drops to zero, but we'd have to manually lock the lower valves to force the steam upward. Someone has to go down into the boiler room beneath the tunnel and turn the main wheel by hand." "And the heat in that room during a manual override?" she asked. "It would be unbearable." "Lethal within minutes," Harrison said, shaking his head. "I'll do it," Abigail declared, throwing off her heavy cloak. "Abigail, you cannot," Thaddeus yelled, forgetting his formalities. "You are the Lady of Ethelgard, and I am Arthur Sterling's daughter," she shot back, her eyes burning with a fierce, unstoppable resolve. "My father died trying to find this mountain. I am not going to let Reginald Montgomery take it from him twice." "Thaddeus, get on the speaking tube. Tell Silas to fall back to the inner blast doors and seal them tight. Tell him his wife is bringing the fire." The boiler room beneath the primary gates was a vision of hell. The air was a thick, suffocating wall of heat that seared Abigail's lungs the moment she wrenched open the iron hatch. The roar of the mountain's underground rivers pounding against the bronze pipes was deafening. She tied a soaked cloth around her nose and mouth, her eyes watering profusely as she descended the grated iron stairs into the belly of the beast. Above her, the battle had reached its terrifying climax. Montgomery's engineers had breached the final load-bearing wall. "Charge!" Montgomery's voice echoed down the ventilation shafts, wild with greedy triumph. "Kill the sentinels. The city is mine." Silas, bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, dragged his last conscious guard behind the massive inner blast doors. He hauled the heavy iron wheel shut, locking the bolts just as Pinkerton bullets began to ping off the steel from the other side. They were trapped. The doors would hold for perhaps 10 minutes against Montgomery's dynamite. Silas leaned his head against the burning iron, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had failed. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting to the brief, stolen moment he had shared with Abigail in the armory. "I swore to protect you, Abigail." Suddenly, the speaking tube beside the door hissed. "Commander!" Thaddeus's voice crackled, frantic and distorted. "Brace yourselves. The lady is in the boiler room. She is venting the mountain." Silas's eyes snapped open, absolute terror gripping his heart. "Abigail? No. Tell her to get out of there." But it was too late. Deep below, Abigail threw her entire body weight against the massive, rust-covered iron wheel that controlled the main geyser bypass. The metal was scalding hot, blistering the palms of her hands through her leather gloves. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance, as she forced the wheel to turn. 1 inch, 2 inches. The mechanical groaning of the pipes was deafening. "For my father," she thought, her vision going white at the edges. For Silas. With a final, agonizing heave, the wheel locked into the open position. The reaction was instantaneous. The sheer, unfathomable kinetic energy of the geothermal geyser denied its usual path, violently redirected upward. In the primary tunnel, Montgomery was directing his sappers to place dynamite on the blast doors when the ground beneath their boots simply ceased to exist. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was an eruption of hyper-pressurized, boiling steam and fractured earth. The floor of the tunnel blew upward, instantly vaporizing the sappers and throwing Siringo and Montgomery backward into the air. The blast tore through the ceiling of the tunnel, ripping a massive crater through 50 feet of solid granite and erupting out onto the snowy slopes of the mountain like a man-made volcano. The Pinkerton mercenaries, hardened men who had faced down cavalry and outlaws, broke and ran in absolute terror as the mountain itself seemed to scream and vomit boiling water and stone. It was a biblical display of power. Behind the blast doors, Silas and his men were thrown to the ground as the shockwave rattled the very foundations of Ethelgard. The roar was so loud it was beyond sound, vibrating in their teeth and bones. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the roaring subsided into a heavy, hissing silence. Silas didn't wait for the dust to settle. He wrenched the locking bolts free and hauled the blast door open. The tunnel was gone. In its place was a massive, steaming chasm, open to the violent, bruised sky above. The snow was falling through the jagged hole, sizzling as it hit the superheated rock. Of Montgomery and his men, there was no sign. Swept away into the abyss or buried beneath thousands of tons of collapsed granite. But Silas wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the access hatch to the boiler room, which had been blown off its hinges. "Abigail," Silas roared, dropping his weapons and sprinting toward the edge of the chasm. He scrambled down the twisted, ruined iron stairs, ignoring the burning metal that scorched his boots. The boiler room was filled with dense, white steam. He stumbled blindly through the fog, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Abigail. Please, God, Abigail." He found her slumped against the base of the massive bypass wheel. Her clothes were soaked, her hands raw and blistered, and she was entirely unresponsive. Silas fell to his knees, scooping her fragile body into his arms. He carried her up through the ruins of the tunnel, emerging into the courtyard of Æthelgard just as the sun began to break through the perpetual storm clouds, casting a brilliant, golden light over the valley. The entire city had gathered, watching in stunned silence as their commander emerged from the smoke, carrying the woman who had saved them all. He carried her directly to the infirmary, refusing to let the physicians take her from his arms until she was laid on a clean cot. For 2 days, Silas Caldwell, the fearsome sentinel of the high passes, did not eat, sleep, or speak. He sat beside her bed, his large, calloused hands gently holding her bandaged fingers, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. On the morning of the 3rd day, Abigail slowly fluttered her eyes open.
This story was
first
posted
thing
on the
she
channel
saw
The
was
Rusty
ceiling
Saddle.
of the
Please do
infirmary,
not repost
painted
it
with
in any
intricate
form.
constellations. The second thing she saw was Silas. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his beard unkempt, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. But when he saw she was awake, a light broke across his face that rivaled the sun over the caldera. "You foolish, beautiful, impossible woman," Silas whispered, his voice cracking as he pressed his forehead gently against her bandaged hand. "You nearly died." Abigail managed a weak, raspy laugh. "I told you, Mr. Caldwell. I am stronger than you know." He lifted his head, his blue eyes entirely bare of their usual hardened guard. "You saved Æthelgard. You saved me. Montgomery is gone. The tunnel is collapsed. The outside world will assume the pass was wiped out by a freak volcanic vent. We are safe. Truly, completely safe." Abigail looked into the eyes of the man she had married in a dusty, corrupt town a lifetime ago. The ragged mountain trapper was a ghost. In his place was a king who had knelt by her side for 3 days. "Then I suppose we have a kingdom to run, Silas," she murmured, turning her hand slightly to intertwine her fingers with his. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, reverent promise sealed in the quiet warmth of the infirmary. It was not a kiss of desperation or adrenaline. It was a kiss of deep, abiding peace. The legend of Arthur Sterling's mad daughter and the feral mountain man faded into frontier folklore. Down in the muddy streets of Bitter Creek, the disappearance of Reginald Montgomery and Charlie Siringo's Pinkertons became a cautionary ghost story, a grim reminder that the jagged San Juan Peak swallowed the greedy without mercy. No one ever found the bodies, and no one ever dared to climb past the black wall again. But high above the world, hidden within the crown of the eternal storm, Æthelgard thrived. Abigail Sterling did not freeze in the wilderness, nor did she fade into the shadows of a powerful man. She stepped into the light of a forgotten empire, ruling alongside Silas with a fierce, brilliant grace. Together, the outcast and the aristocrat guarded the greatest secret of the West, a kingdom built not on silver or blood, but on the unbreakable vow of a love forged in the clouds.